Welcome to Bach in the Bedroom, episode 3. Today I want to talk about the violinist and composer Joseph de Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. He was the son of a noble French plantation owner and an African slave from the island of Guadeloupe in the Antilles. Joseph de Bologne was born probably in 1745, and when he was 10 years old, his father brought him to Paris, where he became a cultural icon thanks to his talents, both as a swordsman and a violinist. De Saint-Georges became well known in the upper echelons of French society, becoming close friends with, among other people, the Duke of Orleans, who was the cousin of the king. And like the Duke of Orleans, he both supported and actually fought in the French Revolution. In the chaos and the Great Terror following the French Revolution, he was imprisoned multiple times, but he was eventually freed. And actually later in his life, he returned to Saint-Domingue to fight in the Haitian Revolution for the freedom of slaves like his mother. De Saint-Georges composed many operas, violin concerti, symphony concertantes, which are basically concerti for two violins and orchestra, and also several chamber works. I want to draw from an article by the violinist and scholar Gabriel Banat, who wrote a book on Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges. So Banat shows the influence of de Saint-Georges' compositions for major composers of his time, including Mozart and Beethoven. So for example, he shows us a passage in Mozart's Symphony Concertante in E-flat major, which is taken from a passage in one of de Saint-Georges' violin concerti. So de Saint-Georges composes the following passage. And in Mozart's Symphony Concertante, Banat also shows the influence of de Saint-Georges' music on Beethoven. So in de Saint-Georges' violin concerto, he writes a kind of arpeggiated upward scale that crosses over three different strings. And in Beethoven's original manuscript for his violin concerto, he writes a very similar figuration over three strings moving up the fingerboard. In his final edition, Beethoven revises that following passage and kind of simplifies it into a different upward scale, but still crossing over two strings and kind of following one hand position using these three fingers and kind of tracking them up the instrument. And it sounds like this. So a similar hand position using these three fingers in a scalar pattern occurs in one of de Saint-Georges' violin duets. So beyond this, one of Beethoven's passages in his violin concerto also comes out of a similar passage in de Saint-Georges' D major violin concerto. So in Beethoven's concerto, and in de Saint-Georges' violin concerto. So there are actually some pretty immediate social connections between Beethoven and de Saint-Georges that back up the similarities in these passages. Beethoven wrote his violin concerto for the violinist Franz Clement, who studied with Giovanni Manet Giornovici. Giornovici attempted to plagiarize several of Saint-Georges' violin pieces and actually taught a lot of Saint-Georges' violin music as his own. So his students would have had a lot of Saint-Georges' music in their fingers. And when Beethoven wrote the violin concerto for Franz Clement, there's evidence that he consulted Clement's advice, and also that he took very similar violinistic figurations from Clement and put them in his concerto. So in the late 18th century, a lot of critics and composers began thinking in terms of the large-scale structures of musical movements and pieces, and Beethoven was kind of held up as one of the icons for this new style of composition. At the same time, of course, performer composers like de Saint-Georges were still innovating new kinds of musical figurations born out of the violin, like the one that we just saw. And composers like Beethoven were importing these figurations kind of wholesale into their works, as again we just saw. So there's no doubt that in many ways Beethoven's concerto was innovative, perhaps revolutionary in the artistic realm, but there's no accounting for the degree to which Beethoven's heroism has been kind of lauded and celebrated in contemporary musical historiography and history. For example, the musicologist Robin Stowell writes, "The only major violin concerto composed between Mozart's 5 concertos of 1775 and Mendelssohn's E minor concerto was the Beethoven concerto. As a model of melodic invention, spaciousness of design, sheer clarity and logic of organization, Beethoven's concerto has gained a place in the repertoire of every violinist who aims at being more than the mere virtuoso, and has become the touchstone marking the maturity of the performing artist." So here, Stowell is kind of denigrating the idea of compositional styles that come directly out of the violin on the grounds that it's in some way immature or merely virtuosic, rather than being properly composerly in the style of Beethoven. Beyond this, the musicologist Nicholas Mathew has drawn attention to the ways in which certain notions of Beethoven as hero have been propagated. For example, in Beethoven's time, the music critic Johann Friedrich Reichardt wrote on the quote-unquote heroes of art, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. He writes, "Their genuine perfected works will remain valid whatever thousand upon thousand merriments time and fashion and their slaves revel in." So the Chevalier de Saint-Georges literally fought for the freedom of the French lower classes and Haitian slaves, and yet in our histories of music, Mozart, Haydn, Mendelssohn, and Beethoven are the heroes. So why is it that in our histories of music, why do we tend to privilege the artistic revolutions of figures like Beethoven over the contexts of social and political revolutions that figures like de Saint-Georges fought and took part in? So before we default to a similar argument that Robin Stowell made about the supremacy of Beethoven's art, we have to remember the fact that de Saint-Georges' music was incredibly popular, influential in his time. And we also have to remember that an aesthetic framework privileging the idea of large-scale compositional form, which Beethoven's music fell into that category, but we have to remember that this framework was cultivated by generations of Austro-German critics, composers, and theorists, like the ones that Nicholas Mathew points to. And these critics, composers, and theorists used this particular musical aesthetic to claim musical supremacy for the Austro-German Romantic musical tradition.